What if the way most Christians keep the Sabbath is actually breaking it? What if the very habits we call holy are the same ones that slowly disconnect us from God's presence? Few dare to ask these questions, but Ellen G. White did. Her prophetic message wasn't comfortable. It was corrective. The Sabbath truth she revealed wasn't about rules. It was about relationship. And in that relationship, there are sacred boundaries we've forgotten. Lines that once crossed can cost not just peace, but salvation itself. Think about it. The Sabbath commandment is the only one that begins with a word of remembrance. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Why? Because God knew we'd forget. We'd remember church but forget stillness. We'd remember hymns but forget humility. We'd remember to stop working but not to stop worrying. That's why this video isn't another sermon, it's a revelation. We'll uncover 10 forbidden things that might seem harmless, but silently break the Sabbath law in the Bible, robbing us of true Sabbath rest meaning. This isn't about fear, it's about freedom. Once you understand these principles, Sabbath stops feeling like a restriction and starts feeling like restoration. You'll see how Sabbath keeping is really spiritual warfare Sabbath. How each act of obedience unlocks a blessing that the enemy desperately wants you to miss. This message is not for the lukewarm. It's for those who long for the full Sabbath blessings God promised. Ellen G. White prophecy made it clear, in the end times, the Sabbath will be the final test of loyalty between human tradition and divine commandment. So stay until the end, because what you'll learn here could completely redefine how you see the seventh-day truth and your place in the final prophetic message unfolding before our eyes. You might discover that what the world calls rest is actually a trap, and what God calls obedience is the key to freedom. If you want to keep growing in truth, wisdom, and preparation for the coming events, subscribe now and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss a revelation like this one. This is not just information, it's an invitation to rediscover God's holy day, the forgotten covenant between heaven and earth. Most people think of the Sabbath as just another square on the calendar, a day to check off, maybe a pause button after 6 days of hustle. But the deeper Sabbath truth goes far beyond the ticking clock. The Sabbath isn't just about time, it's about alignment. It's like tuning an instrument to the divine frequency of heaven. When someone truly understands the Sabbath commandment, they begin to see that this isn't merely about rules, but about rhythm. Ellen G. White prophecy described the Sabbath as a living bridge between the human and the eternal, a sacred pulse where creation and creator breathe in harmony. You don't just keep the Sabbath, you enter it. You cross from chaos to calm, from noise to knowing. It's funny how people say, I need a weekend to rest, and then spend it scrolling through their phones, running errands or binging shows that drain more than they give. That's not rest, that's rotation. True Sabbath keeping is stepping into another atmosphere altogether, one where your mind quiets and your spirit remembers what peace feels like. The seventh-day Adventist tradition often reminds that this day isn't meant for mere inactivity, but for intentional connection. The Sabbath law isn't a restriction, it's an invitation. It's God whispering, stop carrying the world for a moment. I've got it. And that whisper changes everything when you finally believe it. Think about it this way. Imagine standing at the edge of a vast ocean. All week long, you've been building sandcastles, plans, meetings, projects. Then Sabbath comes, and instead of piling more sand, God invites you to step into the water. That's what Sabbath holiness feels like. Immersion, not effort. But stepping in requires trust. Many fear that pausing will make them fall behind. Yet that fear is the very chain God wants to break. What not to do on Sabbath isn't about prohibition, it's about protection. It's about freeing you from the illusion that your worth is tied to your work. Ellen White's Sabbath quotes often warned that breaking the Sabbath is less about the clock and more about the heart. You can stop working but still be restless, planning the next deal in your head, answering one more email just in case. That's a Sabbath violation in disguise. The true Sabbath rest, meaning is to cease from control, to taste what faith feels like in slow motion. When a believer embraces spiritual obedience, every breath becomes worship. The fourth commandment then stops being old law and becomes fresh revelation, a prophetic message echoing through the 21st century, especially in these uncertain times of Bible prophecy 2025 and beyond. And here's the twist. This sacred rhythm isn't just for you. It's for your home, your children, even your thoughts. The Sabbath blessings flow when the atmosphere changes, when family laughter replaces tension, when Sabbath family worship becomes the heart's favorite hour. That's the essence of God's holy day, the Sabbath truth revealed in living color. Once you taste that peace, ordinary weekends feel painfully empty. Yet here's where many stumble, believing partial rest is enough, that half obedience still counts as faith. But that's where the next mystery begins. The sin that hides behind partial obedience. Partial obedience looks harmless at first. It often wears the mask of good intentions. I'll keep the Sabbath next week, or it's just one small task. Yet that tiny compromise carries enormous spiritual weight. The Sabbath commandment was never designed for half measures. It's a full invitation to trust. When someone picks and chooses which parts of God's holy day to honor, they unknowingly begin breaking the Sabbath long before sunset. Ellen G. White prophecy describes this as the subtle erosion of holiness, a slow spiritual drift that begins not with rebellion, but with reasoning. The heart says, "Surely God understands," and the mind agrees until the soul forgets what true obedience feels like. Many believers live in this gray zone without realizing it. They avoid working, but fill the day with noise. Phone calls, business talk, quick errands. They technically rest, yet their thoughts are chained to what they left undone. That's the quiet tragedy of partial obedience. It feels like faith, but it's actually control wearing religious clothing. The Sabbath truth revealed in Scripture shows that God doesn't want fragments of your focus. He wants full surrender. You can't worship on autopilot. The Sabbath holiness message isn't about performance. It's about presence. You either rest in Him or you rest from Him. And those two are not the same. Here's a simple example. Imagine telling a loved one you'll spend the entire day together, but keep checking your messages every 10 minutes. The person might smile politely, but deep down, they know your attention is divided. That's how God feels when His people keep one eye on heaven and the other on their to-do list. Ellen White warnings echo through the centuries. The danger of divided devotion is that it blinds us to our own disobedience. A Sabbath faith test doesn't come wrapped in temptation. It comes disguised as convenience. It whispers just this once, but just this once has built more walls between humanity and heaven than open rebellion ever could spiritual. Obedience demands the courage to let go of what feels urgent in order to embrace what is eternal. The Sabbath law in the Bible was never meant to burden, it was meant to bless. Yet many modern Christians confuse freedom with flexibility. They think honoring the Sabbath means doing their best instead of doing what's right. Ellen White Vision's Sabbath insights remind us that holiness and obedience walk hand in hand. When one fades, the other follows. You can't separate them any more than you can separate breath from life. So when believers treat God's rest day like a suggestion rather than a covenant, they lose more than time. They lose alignment with divine rhythm. Still, there's hope in every wake-up call. True Sabbath keeping isn't about perfection, but direction. You can start again this week, resetting your heart and habits. Plan your Sabbath preparation day like you'd plan a sacred appointment, with intention and reverence. Each time you resist the urge to compromise, you strengthen spiritual muscles that keep your faith steady when the end-time deception grows louder. Because what begins as a small exception today becomes an unbreakable habit tomorrow. And that's where the real battle lies, the urgency that disguises itself as necessity, tempting the believer to trade obedience for convenience. It always starts the same way. It's just this one time. A small favor, an urgent call, an unfinished task. Before we know it, the Sabbath, the very day God designed as a refuge, becomes another battlefield of endless necessities. The Sabbath truth teaches that holy rest isn't just about stopping work. It's about trusting God enough to let go. But modern life has turned busy into a badge of honor. We rush to answer emails, to finish that report, to handle just one quick thing, convincing ourselves it's harmless. Yet Ellen G. White prophecy warned long ago that the enemy would use urgency as his most effective weapon to make believers break the Sabbath without guilt. There's a difference between genuine emergencies and fabricated ones. True emergencies, saving a life, helping the helpless, carry compassion and purpose. But fabricated urgency is born from poor planning or lack of faith. Many believers mistake chaos for calling. They think that God will understand if they run into the office or keep the store open just for a few hours. But each time we bend the Sabbath commandment in the name of practicality, we chip away at our spiritual foundation. The Sabbath holiness message is clear. Faith without rest isn't faith at all. It's fear in disguise. Fear that if we stop, everything will fall apart. But here's the truth. If your life collapses because you obeyed God, then maybe it wasn't built on Him to begin with. Ellen White warnings describe this as the quiet deception of self-dependence. We claim to believe in divine provision, but act as if heaven runs on our schedules. Breaking the Sabbath often hides behind good excuses, deadlines, clients' calls. Yet every urgent task we choose over God's holy day becomes a small declaration of unbelief. It says, "I trust my effort more than His promise." The Sabbath law in the Bible doesn't bend for convenience. It stands as a prophetic message against a world addicted to constant motion. The moment we learn to say no to false urgency, we begin to say yes to peace. Picture a believer who closes their shop at sunset Friday, even when others stay open. To the world, it looks like loss. But to heaven, it's worship. That kind of Sabbath keeping is a testimony louder than a sermon. It tells others, and yourself, that God's commandment outweighs man's calendar. Ellen White, End Time Counsel, reminds us that those who learn to rest now will stand firm later when the final test of faith arrives. If we can't trust Him with one day, how will we trust Him with eternity? The fourth commandment isn't negotiable, it's relational. It's God saying, "I will provide if you will pause." And still the temptation persists. The phone rings, the message pings, the opportunity flashes. Our fingers twitch, ready to respond. That's when the Sabbath preparation day becomes crucial, not as legalism, but as liberation. Prepare ahead so urgency can't steal your peace. Because what begins as a small exception easily turns into a pattern of spiritual compromise. And once the mind normalizes it, the next boundary to fall won't be about urgency, it'll be about speech. The same lips that justified just one more task will soon forget the power of sacred silence. Words are like invisible threads. They weave the atmosphere of every moment. On the Sabbath, those threads can either build a sanctuary or tear one down. The Sabbath truth is that what comes out of your mouth shapes the spiritual climate around you. Ellen G. White prophecy once described careless talk as smoke that dims the light of holiness. You can keep the Sabbath commandment outwardly, no work, no transactions, but still break the Sabbath in your living room through idle chatter, gossip, or debate. What not to do on Sabbath includes not only the physical acts that violate rest, but the words that disturb it. The tongue, Scripture says, has the power of life and death, and the Sabbath tests which one we choose to speak. Think about it. How many holy days have been drained by trivial conversations? We sit at lunch after church and turn sacred reflection into business talk, politics, or complaints about the week. We've all been there. The enemy doesn't need to make you sin loudly. He only needs to make you speak carelessly. Ellen White's Sabbath quotes emphasize that the Sabbath should sound different. Its words should carry grace, gratitude, and peace. Every phrase can either be an offering or an offense. Breaking the Sabbath isn't always about action. Sometimes it's about tone. You can ruin the harmony of God's holy day, not by shouting, but by whispering the wrong things. There's a subtle spiritual warfare Sabbath that happens at every table and phone call. One believer speaks faith, another answers with fear. One shares blessings, another complains. Slowly, the Sabbath holiness fades from the air. It's like playing a hymn out of tune. You can still recognize the melody, but it doesn't move you anymore. The Sabbath message invites believers to guard their words as they guard their time. If your voice could paint a picture of the Sabbath, would it look like peace or pollution? The Sabbath law in the Bible isn't silent about speech. It calls for spiritual discipline that begins with the mouth. Here's a practical way to reset the tone. Before speaking on God's holy day, ask yourself 3 questions. Is this true? Is this kind? Is this necessary? If it fails the test, let it rest. Replace the old habit of criticism with Sabbath reflection. Share a testimony instead of a complaint. Read an Ellen White Vision Sabbath passage aloud with your family instead of debating theology online. That's not suppression, it's elevation. It trains your heart to speak from abundance rather than anxiety. Over time, these tiny choices transform your home into a temple where even laughter becomes worship. The beauty of this practice is that it doesn't end with speech. It seeps into thought. As the words soften, so does the mind. And that's exactly where the next challenge begins. Because even when the tongue falls silent, the mind keeps talking. The question is, what's it saying when nobody else can hear? It's ironic, isn't it? The very thing people chase for relaxation often ends up draining them the most. Modern life worships distraction, screens, shows, endless scrolling. Yet the Sabbath truth was never meant to compete with entertainment. It was meant to free us from it. Ellen G. White prophecy warned that in the last days, pleasure would become the new God and amusement the new altar. Breaking the Sabbath isn't always about going to work. Sometimes it's about refusing to be still. The Sabbath commandment calls us to holy separation, but the world lures us with just one episode, just a few minutes online, and before we know it, those few minutes have stolen the peace the Sabbath was supposed to restore. When people talk about Sabbath keeping today, they think of rituals, no work, no shopping, but rarely do they ask about attention. Where does your focus go on God's holy day? The enemy doesn't always tempt with sin. He tempts with saturation, endless noise, constant stimulation. Ellen White warnings make this clear. The mind that can't rest can't hear God. The Sabbath isn't about boredom, it's about depth. The Sabbath holiness message is that silence isn't empty. It's full. It's the space where divine presence whispers. Yet too many believers fill that sacred silence with digital noise. They trade the still, small voice of God for the loud echo of algorithms. Think about your last Sabbath afternoon. Did it look like Sabbath worship or like Saturday distraction? The true Sabbath rest meaning isn't found in comfort, it's found in communion. Watch how a family transforms when they replace Netflix with Sabbath family worship. Instead of artificial laughter, there's real connection. Instead of meaningless scrolling, there's meaningful reflection. Ellen G. White Inspiration invites us to rediscover the joy of the Sabbath blessings that technology can't imitate. Read the scriptures aloud, walk in nature, sing together, or journal about what God has done. The Sabbath law in the Bible never said, don't enjoy life. It said, enjoy the Creator first. Here's a simple challenge. Spend one Sabbath completely unplugged. No social media, no news, no streaming, just life as it was meant to be lived. You'll be shocked at first. The silence will feel uncomfortable, even loud. But as the hours pass, something changes. Your breathing slows, your mind clears, your heart softens. You begin to feel what Ellen White called the true Sabbath rest, a rest not of the body, but of the soul. You realize entertainment is the counterfeit of peace, and once you taste the real thing, you won't crave the imitation anymore. But even when the screens go dark and the voices fade, there's one more battlefield left, the one inside your head. Because you can turn off the devices and still have a restless mind replaying worries, plans, and fears. That's where the next lesson unfolds. the mind that doesn't stop working even when the body does. You can turn off your phone, close your laptop, even sit quietly in church and still be miles away from peace. That's the paradox of our generation. Bodies resting, minds racing. The Sabbath truth is that true rest begins long before you lie down. It starts when you let go. Ellen G. White prophecy reminds us that many break the Sabbath not with their hands, but with their thoughts. They sit still yet plan Monday's work, replay arguments, or stress over bills. It's a silent breaking of the Sabbath law, invisible to others, but draining to the soul. The fourth commandment isn't just about what you do, it's about what you dwell on. Picture this: you're in worship, but mentally you're reorganizing your schedule, answering imaginary emails, solving problems that don't even exist yet. That's not rest, it's rehearsal for anxiety. The Sabbath holiness message calls us to surrender not just our labor, but our logic. Ellen White Warnings said it best: when the mind refuses to rest, the heart forgets how to trust. That's why Sabbath keeping is spiritual warfare. Sabbath, it's a battle to believe that God runs the universe without your help. Learning how to keep the Sabbath holy means training your thoughts to dwell on divine promises rather than daily pressure. Here's a practical step. Use the Sabbath preparation day to empty your mind of clutter. Write down your worries, your tasks, even your ideas, then consciously hand them over to God. This small act of Sabbath reflection signals heaven that you're serious about rest. Many believers skip this and wonder why their Sabbath worship feels hollow. You can't fill a cup that's already overflowing. God's rest day begins when we choose mental stillness over mental noise. The true Sabbath rest meaning isn't about doing nothing, it's about doing one thing, trusting. When the heart truly trusts, the mind follows. Modern culture glorifies productivity. Even our relaxation has become scheduled, monetized, optimized. We read self-help books about balance, but the Sabbath law in the Bible already gave the secret: stop striving. Take one day each week to remember you're not the provider, God is. Ellen White End Time Counsel warned that in the final days, the test of faith would not be persecution, but pressure. The pressure to keep moving. Yet Sabbath obedience is resistance against that system. It's rebellion against restlessness. It's declaring, I'm not owned by urgency. And here's the beauty: when your mind learns to rest, your life starts to heal. Anxiety fades, creativity returns, faith deepens. You begin to sense God's presence not in lightning, but in stillness. But as soon as peace settles, another distraction creeps in, this time not through busyness, but through desire. A new temptation rises, to fill the void of stillness with the pleasures of consumption, the comfort of buying, eating, or accumulating. And that's where the next warning speaks loudest: the seduction of consumerism that slowly kills divine rest. Walk into any store on a Sabbath, and the lights are bright, the music soft, and the shelves whisper one message: buy something, you deserve it. That's the gospel of the modern age. Consumerism has become the new religion, and the checkout counter its altar. Yet the Sabbath truth stands in silent protest against this restless culture. God's holy day is not a marketplace, but a sanctuary. Ellen G. White prophecy warned that one of the final spiritual deceptions would be a world that no longer knows how to stop consuming. The act of buying, whether it's groceries, gadgets, or comfort, becomes a replacement for faith. We consume to fill what only worship can satisfy. The Sabbath commandment was never just about rest. It was about release. When you refuse to buy or sell on the Sabbath, you're doing more than following a rule. You're declaring independence from a system that measures human worth by spending power. Breaking the Sabbath through mindless consumption doesn't just empty your wallet, it empties your spirit. The Sabbath holiness message reminds us that every purchase made on God's holy day comes with a hidden cost. It funds the machinery of restlessness. Ellen White Warnings urged believers to resist this invisible slavery, to choose trust over transaction. The Sabbath law in the Bible isn't about economic loss. It's about spiritual gain. Think about it practically. When you buy something on the Sabbath, you're paying someone else to work on God's rest day. You might not swing the hammer or ring the register, but you're part of the chain that keeps others from resting. That's why Ellen White Vision's Sabbath insights highlight this point with urgency, because obedience isn't private, it's contagious. When one believer honors the fourth commandment fully, it ripples outward. Families, employees, even strangers feel its quiet power. You become a living protest against the world's addiction to more. That's what Sabbath keeping truly means in a capitalist age. It's not withdrawal, it's witness. There's beauty in preparation. Imagine a family finishing their shopping on Friday afternoon, cooking together, lighting candles before sunset. As the first stars appear, they rest knowing everything is ready. No rush, no checkout lines, no quick deliveries. That's Sabbath preparation at its finest, a rhythm that tells the soul, I have enough because God is enough. Ellen G. White Inspiration calls this the faith of contentment, where true Sabbath rest meaning blossoms not in abundance, but in gratitude. This isn't about deprivation. It's about liberation from the myth that happiness is something you buy, but the temptation doesn't end when the stores close. For some, consumerism simply changes its mask. The need to go, to see, to move, it's all the same hunger wearing a different outfit. And that restless craving leads directly to the next deception. The belief that traveling brings renewal, when in truth, the deepest rest can only be found by staying still. We live in an age where motion feels like meaning. If we're not going somewhere, we fear we're falling behind. But the Sabbath truth was never about movement, it was about presence. Ellen G. White prophecy warned that believers would confuse changing scenery with finding peace. Traveling on the Sabbath might look innocent, visiting family, taking a long drive, going on a spiritual outing, but it often masks a restless spirit that can't stay still. The Sabbath commandment calls for stillness, not scenery. True Sabbath rest meaning is found not in where you go, but in who meets you when you stop. There's a profound irony in trying to find God by constantly moving. The Creator of heaven and earth doesn't hide in distance. He waits in silence. Ellen White Sabbath quotes often remind that God's holy day is a rehearsal for eternity, and heaven isn't a road trip, it's a relationship. When we fill the Sabbath with travel plans, errands, or recreational rest, we trade the sacred for the scenic. The Sabbath holiness message invites us to rediscover the beauty of staying put, to learn that peace isn't a destination, it's a dwelling. Yet many modern believers confuse exhaustion with purpose. They end the day tired, not transformed. Think about it. You can drive 100 miles on Sabbath and still feel spiritually empty, or stay home and feel heaven touch your living room. That's the paradox Ellen White warnings pointed to. When the body keeps moving, the soul can't listen. Sabbath keeping isn't about physical escape. It's about inner encounter. The Sabbath law in the Bible describes rest as a covenant, not a convenience. Every unnecessary journey on God's rest day becomes a subtle breaking of the Sabbath, a way of saying, I'll rest on my terms. But Sabbath obedience isn't about comfort. It's about communion. Practical wisdom makes all the difference. Plan visits, errands, or trips before sunset on Friday. Use the Sabbath preparation day to clear your calendar, to make space for reflection instead of reaction. Try spending one full Sabbath close to home, walking through nature slowly enough to notice the divine fingerprints on every leaf. The Sabbath blessings aren't hidden in distance. They unfold in awareness. As Ellen G. White Inspiration teaches, when the heart is still, heaven speaks. You'll begin to hear God's rest day as a whisper that says, you don't have to chase me. I'm already here. But there's one more form of restlessness that doesn't need a car or a suitcase. It happens right at home. It's not about where we go, but what we make others do. Because even while we rest, some people still labor. And in many homes, that burden falls silently on those preparing meals and serving others. That's where the next challenge surfaces, the hidden injustice of turning the Sabbath table into a place of exhaustion for those who should also rest. Children rarely remember sermons, but they never forget atmospheres. The Sabbath truth teaches that holiness isn't only taught, it's caught. Ellen G. White prophecy revealed that the way parents treat God's holy day shapes how their children perceive Him for life. If the Sabbath feels like a list of don'ts, kids grow up associating faith with boredom. But if the day feels sacred, peaceful, joyful, like a divine celebration, they'll crave that rhythm forever. The Sabbath commandment wasn't written for adults alone. It was a family covenant. You, your son, your daughter, your servant, God said. Everyone rests because everyone matters. Too often, Sabbath becomes the busiest day for parents and the loneliest for children. While adults focus on keeping the Sabbath law correctly, the little ones sit restless, waiting for the sunset, as if waiting for release. That's not Sabbath keeping, that's captivity disguised as devotion. Ellen White's Sabbath quotes remind us that the Sabbath is meant to reflect heaven's joy, not human restriction. So how can we change the atmosphere? Start small. Create simple Sabbath lessons at home, stories under candlelight, songs that lift the heart, prayers whispered before bedtime. Show them that Sabbath worship can be warm, not rigid, alive, not routine. Imagine this scene: a father reads from the Bible, not as duty but as wonder. A mother shares a nature walk with her child, pointing out God's fingerprints in every petal and breeze. The laughter of children mingles with the sound of hymns. That's the Sabbath holiness message in motion. Ellen G. White inspiration said the best sermons are lived, not preached. When children experience joy within structure, peace within discipline, they learn that obedience isn't punishment, it's protection. The Sabbath rest meaning becomes real to them because they've seen it embodied, not enforced, but the opposite is just as true. When kids see parents rushing, arguing, or treating Sabbath like an inconvenience, the message sinks deep. God is demanding, not delightful. Breaking the Sabbath isn't only an act, it's an attitude. The Sabbath family worship should be a fountain, not a formality. If the home becomes a sanctuary every week, children grow up with faith as their native language. They won't need to be convinced of God's love. They'll have felt it in every Sabbath sunset. The Sabbath law in the Bible calls for rest for all, and that includes the youngest hearts among us. Still, there's one final layer to this holy rhythm that even the most faithful families overlook. Because while we may rest, speak kindly, worship together, and protect the peace of the home, something else can quietly erode holiness from within. It doesn't shout, and no one else can see it. It's the private world of thoughts, the hidden corners of the mind that wander far from the presence of God, even while the lips sing hymns. And that's where the next revelation unfolds, the silent battle of thoughts that can desecrate the Sabbath from the inside out. It's easy to keep traditions. Lighting candles, singing hymns, going to church, these are good habits. But the Sabbath truth calls us to something deeper than ritual, transformation. Ellen G. White prophecy didn't describe the Sabbath as a weekly performance, but as a weekly rebirth. The goal of Sabbath keeping isn't just avoiding sin, it's building homes that glow with heaven's atmosphere. Too many believers treat the day as an obligation when it's meant to be an opportunity, a divine reset for the soul and the family. The Sabbath commandment is more than a line in stone. It's an invitation engraved on the heart. Picture a home where the Sabbath doesn't just happen, it's anticipated. The Sabbath preparation day becomes a joyful countdown, not a checklist. Meals are ready, phones are off, hearts are open. As sunset paints the sky, the family gathers not out of duty but desire. They share stories, read scripture, pray, laugh, and remember what matters most. That's the Sabbath holiness message made visible, love in rhythm with eternity. Ellen White's Sabbath quotes remind us that when families learn to rest together, they grow together. The Sabbath law in the Bible was never about isolation, it was about unity. Each week, God offers 24 hours to rebuild what the world has broken. This kind of Sabbath family worship doesn't just bless one day, it transforms the other 6. Children who see parents forgiving, spouses praying, and laughter filling the home learn that faith isn't confined to the church pew. It's lived between meals, in forgiveness after arguments, in hugs after prayer. That's the real Sabbath lifestyle. Holiness practiced in the ordinary. Ellen White warnings cautioned that when Sabbath becomes routine, its power fades. But when Sabbath becomes relationship, its glow never leaves. True Sabbath rest meaning turns homes into sanctuaries and tables into altars. Here's a simple example. Start each Sabbath morning by asking your family one question. Where did we see God this week? Let every answer become a story, every story a testimony. That's how the Sabbath message stays alive, by remembering divine fingerprints in daily life. When families do this, the Sabbath blessings multiply beyond imagination. The seventh day, truth becomes a living cycle of grace, passing from generation to generation. Ellen G. White Inspiration called this the education of eternity, teaching heaven in the language of love. And yet all of this, peace, unity, joy, can be lost if the Sabbath stays external. Because the truest test isn't how we spend those 24 hours. It's how they change us afterward. If the Sabbath ends and we return to the same chaos, have we really kept it? The day God blessed was meant to teach us to live differently all week long, to make every conversation, every decision, every act an echo of divine rest. That's the Sabbath truth revealed. Holiness isn't one day out of 7. It's one day training us to live all 7 in His presence. And now, knowing that, one must ask, if there are blessings this powerful in obedience, what happens when we ignore them? What dangers wait for those who profane the sacred unknowingly? The answer lies at the heart of the revelation, the 10 forbidden things that can cost not just peace, but salvation itself. Now that you've seen the 10 forbidden things that silently destroy the holiness of the Sabbath, the question isn't, did I know them? It's what will I do with them? Because truth without action becomes condemnation. The Sabbath truth isn't just a doctrine, it's a decision. Every Friday at sunset, heaven watches not for perfection but for intention. Do you prepare your heart as carefully as you prepare your table? Do your words, your thoughts, your actions reflect the Sabbath commandment or just the culture around you? Ellen G. White prophecy revealed that in the end times, Sabbath keeping will be the greatest test of spiritual obedience. It's not about earning salvation. It's about proving love. The Sabbath was never meant to be a rule. It's a relationship checkpoint. God's holy day still whispers, do you trust me enough to stop? Each act of obedience becomes a weapon in spiritual warfare Sabbath. Each moment of surrender becomes a declaration that God is enough. And the moment you begin to live that truth, the Sabbath blessings start to multiply in ways no entertainment, no possession, no worldly pleasure ever could. Take a moment to reflect. Which of these 10 truths pierced your heart the most? Was it the constant movement that keeps you from presence? The noise that replaces silence? The purchases made out of habit instead of faith? Maybe it's not about what you do, but what you allow to continue unchallenged. That's where transformation begins, when conviction turns into commitment. So I challenge you, this coming Sabbath, do one thing differently. Choose stillness where you once chose activity. Choose prayer where you once chose distraction. Choose to honor the 4th commandment with the reverence it deserves. Watch how the atmosphere around you changes, how peace replaces pressure, how clarity replaces confusion, how joy replaces guilt. That's the power of Sabbath truth revealed in daily life. If this message awakened something in you, don't let it fade. Subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications. Because every week we uncover more of what Ellen G. White called the message for the final generation. Leave your reflection below. Which of these Sabbath lessons spoke most to your heart? Your words might be the encouragement someone else needs to begin their own journey of obedience, faith, and restoration. Remember, the Sabbath isn't just a command, it's a gift. Guard it as if your life depends on it, because in the truest sense it does.